My name's William Burke. I recently made a video called Protestants versus Free Will. In this video, I explained how all Protestants who accept free will inevitably teach faith plus works for salvation, also known as a works salvation. In my video, I pointed out how Dr. Leighton Flowers teaches faith plus works for salvation. Dr. Leighton Flowers then responded to my video in a video called Is Faith Alone and Free Will Incompatible? Responding to a Catholic critic. In his response, he attempted to refute my arguments, but I will show Leighton Flowers does teach a works salvation. Dr. James White, a well-known Protestant apologist, also points out that Leighton Flowers' belief in free will causes him to reject faith alone, and therefore teach a works salvation.
And yes, if taken to its consistent conclusion, what both Leighton Flowers said and Jonathan Pritchett said would violate justification by faith alone. It would.
We will first see a clip of Leighton Flowers introducing the video I did that he responded to.
Let's look at this video. You can see that's the cover art for the video, and so these are the individuals that he addresses in this particular video to combat Protestantism as a whole. And so he pretty much attacks, first of all, traditionalist or what I would call probably non-Calvinist, and then he turns his attack onto Calvinists themselves.
The major counter-argument that Leighton Flowers did was a mischaracterization of works salvation. He uses it to mean gaining salvation with works and without Christ's atonement, when its actual meaning is gaining the application of Christ's atonement through faith and works. In the following clip, we'll first see a section of my video, and then we'll hear Leighton Flowers' response. But herein lies the problem. Free will and faith alone are incompatible. This is because a belief in free will always leads to a belief in a works salvation.
Okay, so that's his major contention for attacking those of us who are free will advocates among Protestants, is that if free will is true, that you have to hold to a works-based salvation is ultimately what he comes down to. And again, this would depend on how you define faith versus works and how Paul was understanding the difference between faith and works.
Listen carefully. Leighton Flowers is about to redefine works salvation.
Admitting that you can't earn or work your way to heaven through good deeds is not in itself a good deed that earns or merits your salvation. Okay? Let me say that again to be real clear. Okay? Admitting that you can't work enough to earn or merit your salvation is not in and of itself a meritorious work that earns and merits your salvation.
He replaces its actual meaning of gaining the application of Christ's atonement through faith and works with the meaning of works apart from Christ's atonement, gaining salvation directly. This is why he says there would be no reason for Christ to die.
If it were, then there would have been no reason for Christ to die.
He is mischaracterizing a works salvation to mean gaining your salvation directly, without Jesus' atonement.
People who just admitted that they could not do it, admitted that they were lost, admitted that they needed a Savior, would immediately just be saved on the merit of their confession.
Unlike Leighton Flowers, John MacArthur can accurately articulate what a works salvation is. A works salvation is a term used by Protestants to mean adding works to faith as a ground of justification.
Simply adding works to faith as a ground of justification is a different gospel.
Since Catholicism is considered the epitome of a works salvation, it's important to understand the basics of Catholicism to ground our definition of a works salvation. Catholics never believed that works can gain salvation without Christ's atonement. This is addressed in the Council of Trent. John MacArthur can articulate it.
In fact, Trent says, and I quote, "If anyone says that man may be justified before God by his own works without the grace of God through Jesus Christ, let him be anathema."
Catholics believe that for an individual to get to heaven, Christ's death was necessary, the person having faith was necessary, and the person's works are taken into account and play a decisive role. That last addition of adding works as one of the requirements of justification turns the salvation system into a works salvation system. Protestants consider adding works as a requirement to justification a false gospel.
Understanding that faith plus works is a false gospel, therefore defines the battle in which we must contend for the faith. And
a works salvation is not salvation by human works apart from Christ. A works salvation is a salvation system that has works as a deciding factor of someone's salvation, and the Protestants condemn it because it's not by faith alone.
It's not by faith alone.
Let's listen to Leighton Flowers' mischaracterization again.
If it were, then there would have been no reason for Christ to die. People who just admitted that they could not do it, admitted that they were lost, admitted that they needed a Savior, would immediately just be saved on the merit of their confession.
The issue is not if Christ's death was necessary for salvation, as Leighton Flowers' mischaracterization would have you believe. Both Catholics and Protestants agree that no one could be saved without Christ's atonement and the grace that flows from it.
We all agree there's grace. We all agree there's faith. We all agree it's through Christ.
The issue is this: since Jesus Christ died on the cross and atoned for our sins, do we need to exercise our free will to get that atonement applied to us? To put it another way, is human free will decisive in the equation of a person's salvation? The Calvinists say no, and the Catholics say yes. But Leighton Flowers, like the Catholics, also says yes. This is why many Calvinists compare Protestants who hold free will, often called Arminians, to Catholicism. Dr. James White makes this point through quoting Francis Turretin in his book. Francis Turretin says, "The Arminians, who bring popery and Pelagianism." This is why Calvinists don't have to strawman a works salvation. They can correctly describe Catholicism, considered to be the epitome of works salvation, contrast it with Calvinism, and show how they reject it. On the other hand, Leighton Flowers has to strawman works salvation to make it seem like he still rejects it, but his strawman is anathematized by actual Catholic teaching. This massive strawman he did was why he was stunned at the end of my video when I said that Jesus merited the grace of justification for mankind on the cross, and that grace is applied to us by faith and works. Watch Leighton Flowers' stunned reaction when I say something that doesn't fit with his strawman premise. Jesus merited the grace of justification for mankind on the cross.
What? Jesus merited? Jesus merited it? Or does your faith and your works merit it? Because you just said Jesus merited it. Which is it?
It's important to notice how Leighton Flowers conflates the grace itself of justification that Jesus won on the cross with how that merit is applied. Those two things are separate issues. Let's break it down.
Jesus merited it?
Yes, Jesus merited the grace itself of justification. This is one issue.
Or does your faith and your works merit it?
Your faith and your works don't merit the grace itself of justification. They're the grounds on which the grace Jesus won is applied to us. This is another issue. Leighton Flowers rejects the Calvinist idea of limited atonement, and therefore he believes that Jesus died for everyone, and anyone could be saved. But he isn't a universalist, so he doesn't believe that everyone will be saved. The grace Christ won that could potentially save everyone, that's the grace itself of justification. The point of contention is to whom does Christ apply his merits? This is an important question, because Christ's merits only save us from hell when they're applied to us. Again, the question is, to whom are the merits of Jesus Christ applied? Does God base his application of Christ's blood on faith alone, or on faith and works? Leighton Flowers believes man gains the application of Christ's merits through faith and works, and he therefore teaches a works salvation. Although he affirms the slogan of faith alone, he denies it in practice, because he believes that the merits of Jesus are applied to men based on faith and acts of free will. He wouldn't say that acts of free will are, quote, meritorious for salvation, but he still thinks they are decisive to salvation. For instance, he thinks praying can be decisive to your salvation. When trying to respond to this point, he deflects by saying prayer, in his view, isn't meritorious.
He's once again going back to that original conflation that I mentioned. is that he thinks that as someone prays, and that helps affect something, in other words, it has an effect or it helps a help, therefore, it is faith plus that causes salvation.
I'm saying that if you believe prayer can be one of the causes of Christ's merits being applied to you, if you believe that, you therefore teach a work salvation, since prayer played a decisive role in getting Christ's merits applied to you. Leighton Flowers doesn't appear to understand my point, because if he did, he would realize that he teaches a form of work salvation just like Catholicism. So in order to combat my point, he again conflates the merits Christ won on the cross, the grace itself of justification, with who that merit is applied to. He does a straw man and acts as if my point is that prayer in and of itself could have saved humanity without Christ's sacrifice. That's not at all my point.
And again, if that thing in and of itself could merit salvation, then there would have been no reason for the atonement. There would be no reason for Jesus to die.
I'm saying that if you believe prayer can be one of the causes of Christ's merits being applied to you, if you believe that, you therefore teach a work salvation, since prayer played a decisive role in getting Christ's merits applied to you. Let me give you an example. Let's say there's an unbeliever named Joe. Joe decides to pray to know if God is real. Ask yourself, can such a prayer be a decisive factor in Joe's salvation? That is to say, if Joe hadn't prayed that prayer, he would have never converted and never had Christ's atonement applied to him, and ultimately been damned. But since he did pray that prayer, God gave him some extra grace, and that grace snowballed into him converting and having Christ's atonement applied to him. In the question I constructed, Joe was an unbeliever when he said the prayer, so you can't argue that he's praying because he's saved. Although the prayer isn't the only cause of Joe's salvation, the question is, can prayer be a decisive cause? If Leighton answers no, it can't be a decisive cause, then he denies that prayers have an effect. But Leighton Flowers answers yes.
The prayer of a righteous man availeth much. In other words, prayers make a difference. And I agree with Michael Brown on that. Prayers do make a difference.
He therefore believes in salvation by faith plus works. Prayer is a work. Some argue that prayer is not a work, but that's just redefining works as faith in an attempt to be consistent with faith alone. Whether or not the action is decisive is the question. For example, let's say a man who is not a believer is committing adultery, and he exercises his free will to stop. Ask yourself this: in Leighton Flowers' theology, is it possible that God graces that man with the knowledge of Jesus for his good deed of ceasing adultery? If Leighton answers yes, then he believes in a work salvation, since the man's decision to do the work of obeying the seventh commandment played a decisive role in his salvation. Let me simplify it. If Leighton Flowers believes that someone using their free will to do moral actions before they are saved, whether a positive action, like prayer, or a negative action, like not taking God's name in vain, if he believes that those moral acts of free will draw down God's grace and can decisively affect the person's salvation, then he believes in a work salvation. Now, usually when an argument like this is presented to a Protestant, they'll say they don't do works to get saved, but they do them because they're saved. Leighton said something similar to this in his response to me.
Well, a true faith is going to produce works.
But in Leighton's theology, this argument only makes sense when the question is about works done after someone is saved. I'm talking about works done before the point of being saved in his theology. If Leighton admits that works done before the point of being saved can affect whether or not someone ultimately gets saved, then he believes in a work salvation, because he thinks those works are one of the causes of salvation, although not the only cause. Leighton Flowers' theology teaches that works done before the point of salvation are decisive in whether or not God gives the knowledge needed to be saved to a particular person. This is Leighton's tests of truth teaching. Leighton teaches that God will give an unbelieving soul a little light, and if the soul is good with that light or truth, then the soul levels up, and God sends another test, and if they level up enough, God will give them the knowledge they need to be saved. Those acts of passing tests of light or truth are works, and in Dr. Flowers' theology, they play a decisive role in some people's salvation. When responding to this point from my original video, Leighton Flowers again mischaracterizes the meaning of works salvation. Leighton Flowers responds to my point about him teaching works salvation.
God, in his graciousness, is bringing more light, more revelation to people like Cornelius, which, by the way, as we'll get into, I think that's what he still does today. If someone is faithful with a little light of a little revelation, then God brings more light, more revelation. He brings the gospel. He brings messengers. He brings missionaries. And God is faithful to bring more light to those who are faithful with a little, so that they too know the means by which they are saved.
This is clearly a work salvation. Watch again how Leighton Flowers redefines a work salvation to mean being saved without Christ's atonement.
No, it's not a work salvation. Again, if Revelation saved, then he might have a point. But Revelation doesn't save. Atoning work of Christ saves.
He even laughs a little bit when making his point, as if his basic straw man is some bombshell point.
Revelation saved, then he might have a point. But Revelation doesn't save. Atoning work of Christ saves.
My point stands. Those free will acts of passing tests are works, because he's talking about someone who by his own definition doesn't have faith yet. So there's no way he can argue that those free will acts are done because of faith, unless he tries to argue the absurd position that works done before salvation are done because of a future faith. So, in Dr. Flowers' theology, one of the conditions for certain people's election, that is to say, a condition for them ultimately ending up in heaven and being elect, one of those conditions is passing tests of truth. And passing tests of truth is a work. So similar to Catholics, Leighton Flowers believes that works are decisive in determining who ends up in heaven. This argument is one reason why Calvinists adopted the doctrine of unconditional election. By adopting unconditional election, the Calvinists, unlike Leighton Flowers, can remove works from having a decisive effect on whether or not someone chooses to have faith, and by extension have Christ's atonement applied. In Calvinism, whether or not someone ends up believing is entirely based on God's eternal decree, which took nothing but God's own will into consideration. But that's the thing. Calvinism has had many more theological battles and debates than Dr. Flowers' theology, and over time, Calvinism has grown to be more internally consistent than many other forms of Protestantism. Although Calvinism is wrong and inconsistent with biblical principles, as my video showed, it's much more internally consistent than Leighton Flowers' theology. This is because Calvinism started almost 400 years ago, whereas Leighton Flowers' theology, known as provisionalism or Southern Baptist traditionalism, only started in 2012. This is the Connect 316 website that Leighton Flowers directs people to. Quote, in the summer of 2012, after hundreds of Southern Baptists had declared their affirmation of traditionalist theology. Here's another quote. Once completed, the traditional statement was released and soon made history. So Leighton Flowers' salvation system was only developed and codified 5 years ago. This is relevant because he accuses me of making a blatantly false statement in my video. I make the point that in Protestant theology, if you choose to believe in Jesus via your own autonomous free will, the act of believing is a work. Leighton Flowers listens and responds to my point, and calls it blatantly false, and says it's not in Protestant teaching or doctrine. But as we will see, Dr. Leighton Flowers, like all Protestants who hold to free will, inevitably contradicts his core doctrine. It's surprisingly easy to prove that all Protestants who hold to free will teach a works salvation. If you ask the following question, their belief in a works salvation becomes clear. The question is this: after hearing about Jesus, why do some men believe and others don't? If they answer by saying, well, some men chose to believe and others didn't, that, in and of itself, is a works salvation.
That's wrong. That's false. That's blatantly false. That is not a work salvation. It wasn't in Paul's mind, and it's not in the Protestants' teaching, doctrine.
In historical Protestant doctrine, any idea of free will is contrary to salvation by faith. This goes all the way back to Luther. It doesn't make an exception for believing in Jesus with your free will. It rejects free will altogether. It does this because according to historical Protestantism, if you need to use your autonomous free will to get God's grace, then the grace is no longer free, since you had to do the work of using your free will to get it. Leighton Flowers actually had a debate on free will, and one of his opponents was Dr. Sonny Hernandez. In the debate, Dr. Hernandez called Leighton Flowers' belief that we use our autonomous free will to believe in Jesus a, quote, lie from hell.
To use logic here, universally the term free will means that if the will is free, then it is not predetermined or uncaused, that means God does not determine a man's decision to be saved. Now, let me explain to you something that's very important about this, okay? Flower's position has more in common with Catholicism than it does with Christ. Roman Catholic Catechism 155, here's what it says. Human intellect and the will cooperate with divine grace. It says, believing is the act of the intellect assenting to divine truth by command of the will moved by God through grace. This right here is not language from heaven. This is lies from hell.
Dr. Hernandez also made the point that free will is considered a heresy in historical Protestantism and cited a book written in the year 1700.
The Arminian position on free will, this is somewhat of a disclaimer I want to share very quickly so that way you know the position that I'm coming from. There is a classical work out there that is written by Christopher Ness, and it's titled The Antidote to Arminianism. And let me explain to you a little bit about the content you're going to find in that book. It calls Arminianism a foul heresy, the root and core of all heretical false doctrine.
Historical Protestant doctrine is monergistic. It teaches that God chooses the person, and the person's response is not a choice in the truly free will sense of the word choice. It denies men's free will, and it denies that men use their free will to believe in Jesus, and it considers a belief in free will a heresy. Luther denied that men choose Christ with their free will. Calvin denied it. Charles Spurgeon denied it. R.C. Sproul denied it. And many well-known Protestants of today deny it. James White denies it. John MacArthur denies it. John Piper denies it. In fact, Leighton Flowers used to deny it since he used to be a Calvinist. Not only that, but in his book, he says that the forefathers of his Southern Baptist faith were Calvinists. Quote, "We hired John Piper, along with various other notable Calvinistic communicators, to speak at many of the events I directed. I very much loved being a part of this, quote, brotherhood of ministers who proudly affirmed the doctrine of Spurgeon and the forefathers of our Southern Baptist faith." The idea of men using autonomous free will to believe in Jesus is contrary to historical Protestant doctrine. Historical Protestant doctrine considers any belief in true free will to be inconsistent with faith alone. Not only does the historical position of Protestantism deny free will, but modern Protestantism is also starting to heavily lean in that direction. In fact, Leighton Flowers even did a video where he complained that his own denomination, the SBC, is starting to become Calvinist.
How it just seems to be going more and more this way with Southern Baptists, especially because that's my denomination and that's what I'm concerned about. This trending that we're seeing within the Southern Baptist Convention to find and nominate and to raise up Calvinists under the guise of this is gospel-centered.
Historical Protestantism, and much of modern Protestantism, is monergistic. It completely denies man's autonomous free will, and it doesn't give any exceptions to the act of believing in Jesus. So my statement was not, quote, blatantly false. Historical Protestantism considers the idea that we choose Jesus with our free will a heresy, and contrary to faith alone. Leighton Flowers' total misunderstanding of what a works salvation is causes him to make straw man arguments against the Catholic salvation system. Listen to this.
Because obviously, if it's faith and works, that is ultimately the way you're saved. Is how many are enough? I mean, how many good works do you have to do to finally get the merit of Christ applied to you? And that's where their systematic falls on its head.
The Catholic salvation system does not fall on its head. A person gets Christ's merits applied to them through baptism, and if they lose their justification through a mortal sin, they get it back through the sacrament of confession. The grace from Jesus Christ that flows from these sacraments place the recipient in the state of grace. If the person dies in the state of grace, they gain eternal life. The grace Christ won on the cross flows through the Catholic sacraments. Positive good works, like prayer, keep us on the road to heaven by making sure we continue to do the negative good works of not fornicating, not committing adultery, not blaspheming, etc. Now notice how James White, a Calvinist, can accurately describe the Catholic salvation system. In his book, The Potter's Freedom, James White makes the point that Protestants who hold to free will and Catholics both believe in a similar salvation system. Dr. James White accurately describes the Catholic system because it plays to his advantage, since by doing so, he can show how the free will Protestants believe very similarly to the Catholics. Quote, "In Roman Catholicism, the work of Christ merits grace. This grace is mediated to men and women through the sacraments of the Church. The grace of justification, for example, is mediated through the sacrament of baptism, and, when one loses that grace through the commission of a mortal sin, through the sacrament of penance. This grace then places the believer in the state of grace. The death of Christ then is necessary to provide the key element or foundation of this system of salvation. Without it, there would be no grace to flow through the sacraments. In essence, it makes men savable, by inaugurating a system whereby men save themselves." This description of Catholicism, and by extension, a description of what's known as a work salvation, unlike Dr. Flower's description, is accurate. As a Catholic who rejects faith alone, I have no problem saying God made a system predicated on Christ's sacrifice in which I save myself. If you continue the quote, Dr. White says, quote, "In essence, it makes men savable, by inaugurating a system whereby men save themselves, but it does not actually save." End quote. Jesus' work on the cross gives men a chance at salvation. Jesus' death on the cross didn't do 100% of the things necessary for them to be saved. That's what Dr. White means when he says, "It does not actually save." Even though Jesus died on the cross, men still need to use their free will to do certain things in order to get Christ's merits applied to them. Mainly, believe in what the Church teaches, receive Christ's grace through the sacraments, and avoid mortal sins. Leighton Flowers does not want to correctly describe Catholicism, for if he did, the similarities would become clear, and one could more plainly see that both he and Catholicism teach faith plus works. Leighton Flowers believes in a work salvation system. His salvation system is not fundamentally different from the Catholic system. He, like Catholics, believes that God made a system predicated on Christ's sacrifice, in which men save themselves. In both systems, whether or not certain acts of free will are done, play a decisive role in someone's salvation. The difference between the systems is in which acts determine if one goes to heaven. In the Catholic system, the acts of free will done before and after one enters the state of grace play a decisive role in an individual's salvation. In Leighton's system, the acts of free will done before the point of being saved play a decisive role in an individual's salvation. According to Leighton, passing tests of truth play a decisive role. Prayers play a decisive role. And choosing to believe in Jesus plays a decisive role. And even if, for the sake of argument, we say that using your free will to accept Jesus is somehow not a work, it doesn't matter, because prayer and passing tests still play a decisive role in his salvation system. Faith alone logically necessitates eliminating free will. Luther understood this and called anyone who argued for free will a Christ denier. Quote, "I wish my opponents would realize that when they argue for free will, they are denying Christ." This is also why Dr. James White says that Leighton Flowers would deny faith alone if he took his belief in free will to its logical conclusion.
And yes, if taken to its consistent conclusion. What both Leighton Flowers said and Jonathan Pritchett said would violate justification by faith alone. It would.
But as my video showed, eliminating free will has its own set of problems.
Watch the whole video, and he does make some pretty strong cases against our Calvinistic brothers with regard to their inconsistencies.
The Calvinists can see how the free will Protestants logically deny faith alone, and the free will Protestants can see the inconsistencies in Calvinism. The reality is that faith alone is a false gospel. The Bible teaches that Christ's merits are applied to us through faith and works, not by faith alone. Ye see then how that by works a man is justified, and not by faith only?